Welcome to the second in a series of videos on mental health at work from an Alberta occupational health and safety perspective. This series is intended to educate worksite parties about the importance of maintaining psychologically safe workplaces that value mental health. Although many concepts that will be discussed in the series are wildly applicable, the information provided in these videos will be primarily specific to worksites in Alberta. For more information on the topics that we'll be covering in this video, see the resources posted in the video description. Before we begin, we have a disclaimer and copyright notice that we need to bring to your attention. We do our best to ensure that the information provided in this webinar is accurate and up to date. However, if there is any discrepancy between what is presented in this webinar and the OHS legislation, the legislation is considered correct. I'll give you a few moments to read the copyright notice. When we think of hazards to health and safety in the workplace, we often tend to only think of things like dangerous equipment, slippery surfaces, or other physical hazards. However, mental health issues at work also have real and serious effects on worker health and safety. For example, between 2016 and 2020, Alberta's Workers' Compensation Board claims for mental disease steadily increased. They were the second most common diseases resulting in WCB claims for that time period, and represented almost half of the top 20 claim categories in terms of total claim costs. WCB claims in this category included post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, and other mental health syndromes. It's clear that a paradigm shift is needed. We need to start thinking about hazards to mental health in the workplace, known as psychosocial hazards, in the same way we think about physical hazards. In fact, Alberta's occupational health and safety legislation requires employers to assess and control hazards to mental health at their workplace. In our previous video, we talked about mental health and psychological safety at work and looked at some of the potential barriers to achieving psychological safety in the workplace, such as stigma, lack of knowledge, and resistance to change. We also defined workplace psychosocial hazards. These include hazards such as harassment, violence, traumatic events, and long-term exposure to factors such as role ambiguity, increasing job demands, or a disrespectful work environment. We also looked at the financial, legal, and health-related benefits of a psychologically safe workplace for employers and workers, and talked about why it's important, and in fact, a legal requirement in Alberta, to identify and address workplace psychosocial hazards as part of a hazard assessment. In this video, we'll look at how to do that, how to identify psychosocial hazards in a hazard assessment, and find ways to eliminate or control them. A fundamental part of occupational health and safety is hazard assessment and control. A hazard assessment identifies hazards at a worksite and then determines ways to eliminate or control them. In other words, mitigate them or lessen their impact. In Alberta, employers are legally required to conduct a hazard assessment. The National Standard of Canada for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace, which we will refer to as the National Standard, defines psychosocial hazards as elements of the work environment, management practices, or organizational practices that pose a risk to mental health and well-being. Hazard assessments must identify not just physical hazards, but psychosocial hazards as well. These hazards must be eliminated or controlled if it is not reasonably practicable to eliminate them. This needs to be done for every job and every task at a worksite. Under Alberta's OHS legislation, if an organization has a health and safety committee or health and safety representative, the employer must involve them in the assessment and control of psychosocial and physical hazards. Any affected workers must also be involved. So now that we know a little bit more about hazard assessments, let's look at how to take the first step, identifying the psychosocial hazards that could affect a workplace. Because every worksite is different, it is difficult to prescribe a specific method for doing this. However, the national standard defines factors that impact psychological safety at work. When identifying psychosocial hazards, employers may want to consider these factors and think about how these might affect their own workspace. Links to videos that examine these factors in detail, as well as a link to the national standard itself, are provided in the description below this video. Employers can use the national standard as a framework to guide them in developing an effective psychological health and safety program. Once a hazard assessment has identified the psychosocial hazards that could affect workers' health and safety, the next step is to take measures to eliminate each hazard, or control the hazard if eliminating is not reasonably practicable. Some psychosocial hazards can be eliminated completely, particularly if they are of a physical or tangible nature. For example, if harsh fluorescent lighting in a workspace is causing a group of workers psychological distress, changing the lighting could potentially eliminate the hazard. In situations where it is not reasonably practicable to eliminate a psychosocial hazard, they need to be controlled. Controlling hazards identified in a hazard assessment involves an OH&S concept called the hierarchy of controls. In this hierarchy, engineering controls, physical changes to a worksite, are preferred and implemented first. If these are not sufficient, administrative controls, policies, procedures, or training, are implemented. If neither of these types of controls is sufficient to control the hazard, personal protective equipment, or PPE, needs to be used. If a hazard cannot be eliminated or controlled using a single control method, a combination of engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE can be used. Let's take a look at each of these types of controls in turn and see how they can be used in relation to psychosocial hazards. In the hierarchy of controls, engineering controls are physical changes to a workplace to mitigate a hazard or reduce its potential impact. Because physical elements of a workplace can affect workers' mental health, engineering controls may be effective in some cases. For example, if constant noise from loud ventilation fans is an existing or potential hazard to workers, potential engineering controls could include reducing the noise by installing soundproofing, running the fans at a lower speed, or changing the fans to a type that is not as loud. Note that engineering controls which mitigate a psychosocial hazard might have the added benefit of mitigating a physical hazard, to workers' hearing in the above example. If engineering controls cannot adequately address a hazard, administrative controls must be introduced. Administrative controls are policies, procedures, or other actions that aim to mitigate hazards by changing the way people work. For example, the national standard calls for organizations to commit to developing a psychological health and safety management system, a collection of policies and procedures to be integrated with, or compatible with, the organization's governance practices and other systems. Such a system might contain policies and procedures that address psychosocial hazards identified in a hazard assessment. Worker training related to psychosocial hazards is another important administrative control. Potential training topics might include how to recognize workplace psychosocial hazards, general knowledge about the types of workplace psychosocial hazards and their associated health effects, a review of the employer's psychosocial hazard policies and procedures, how to respond to workplace psychosocial hazards and incidents. To determine what other administrative controls would work best in their particular workplace, employers can again consider the factors mentioned in the national standard. What kind of policies or procedures might mitigate potential hazards created by, for example, the demands of the job or the organizational culture? For instance, if a job is particularly stressful, employers might consider spreading the duties of the job to more people. For physical hazards, if engineering and administrative controls cannot adequately address them, PPE controls must be introduced. Of course, most psychosocial hazards can't be controlled using PPE, such as respirators, steel-toed boots, or protective gloves. But there are some things that can protect psychological health and safety. For example, as mentioned in the national standard, a personal alarm system or privacy barriers can be considered as PPE for psychological health and safety. There are also personal and organizational strategies that can function as psychosocial PPE. For example, individuals can find ways to manage their stress levels and increase their mental well-being, such as through yoga, meditation, or talking with trusted friends. Employers can provide and promote wellness programs, coping skills seminars, and sessions to develop skills such as communication skills. And all worksite parties can do their part to promote education and awareness of mental health issues and barriers in the workplace. In addition to the hazard assessment, elimination, and control requirements under OH&S legislation, there are other legislative requirements that are relevant to addressing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. For example, Part 27 of the Occupational Health and Safety Code specifies requirements for addressing violence and harassment in the workplace, including development of prevention plans, policies, and procedures. For more information about the legislated responsibilities of employers, supervisors, and workers, please refer directly to Alberta's OH&S legislation. Even if all worksite parties collaborate and put their best efforts towards controlling all physical and psychosocial hazards, incidents might still occur. If they do, there are some legal requirements for reporting that might apply. For more details on these requirements, visit alberta.ca/reportseriousinjuriesincident.aspx. In addition to Alberta's legal requirements, the national standard calls for all workplace incidents related to mental health and safety to be reported, investigated, and documented, according to the procedures developed by the organization, in an effort to try to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. The investigation should be done by an impartial expert in psychological injury and incident investigation. Due to the personal nature of these types of incidents, they may go unreported for fear of reprisal or blame. For this reason, reporting and investigation processes should respect the right to privacy and not put the person reporting the incident in jeopardy. If workers have been psychologically injured, it's important to give them access to resources and support. These can include employee assistance programs and counseling, workplace accommodations, return to work planning and modified duties, and peer support networks to remove social isolation. Doing a hazard assessment and eliminating or controlling hazards is just one step towards creating and maintaining a psychologically healthy and safe workplace. As is the case when trying to ensure physical health and safety in the workplace, keeping a workplace psychologically healthy and safe involves ongoing vigilance and a commitment to continuous improvement. Psychological health and safety needs to become an important part of the workplace culture and embedded in the work practices of the organization. In short, all worksite parties should regularly ask themselves the fundamental question, what can I do today and in the future to make my workplace psychologically healthier and safer? And then think about ways they can act on that answer. Thank you for watching. Hopefully, you now have a better idea of psychosocial hazards in the workplace and what you can do at your workplace to address these hazards. Don't forget to check out the links posted below in the video description for more information and resources related to the topics covered in this video. This tutorial series is produced by the OH&S Prevention Initiative, a partnership between the Alberta government, industry, labor, and health and safety organizations. The following organizations contributed to this tutorial: Alberta Labour and Immigration, Alberta Workers' Health Centre, United Nurses of Alberta, Workers' Compensation Board Alberta, Alberta Safety Council, Alberta Construction Safety Association, Continuing Case Safety Association, Alberta Municipal Health and Safety Association, Alberta Health Services, Energy Safety Canada, Alberta Motor Transport Association, Manufacturers Health and Safety Association.